The storm arrived with a voice like ancient sorrow, rattling the bones of Sophie May Whitlock's isolated cabin. Its wails slipped through every crack in the weathered logs, crying like forgotten spirits mourning what once was. She sat hunched by the dying embers, clutching a tin cup filled with chicory's bitter embrace. Real tea had vanished 3 harsh seasons ago, along with sweetness of any kind. Only salt remained, crystallized in her weary soul, enough to preserve her through another half-decade of emptiness. Beyond her frost-kissed windows, the world had surrendered to winter's white siege. Drifts climbed her glass like ghostly fingers, each flake falling with the weight of eternity. Her land disappeared beneath nature's shroud, fence lines erased, barn roof bowing under heaven's burden. In such absolute quiet, death seemed possible for the earth itself. Sometimes Sophie prayed it was true. Storms once brought joy when Henry drew breath beside her. Together they'd race to secure shutters, their voices echoing with shared purpose through rooms that remembered laughter. They'd huddle beneath thick wool, their infant nestled between beating hearts, spinning tailies while wind raged like banished wolves beyond their walls. 5 winters had buried that life. Fever claimed their child first, then her beloved, then neighbors with their cruel whispers. Finally hope itself. Christmas still found her draped in her wedding gown, now hanging like white defeat from shoulders grown sharp. The fabric, once pristine, bore time's yellow stains and smoke's gray kiss. Daily she dressed in Henry's old shirts and skirts patched beyond recognition, boots split and bound with strips of hide. Her hair, formerly curled and properly pinned, now fell in uneven lines around her jaw, hacked short when the world no longer deserved beauty. That particular evening she drifted through her dwelling like a specter haunting her own existence. Her numb fingers split kindling, poured water from barrels still frozen near dying coals, fed flames that couldn't warm the ice in her chest. The cabin's silence had aged into something tangible, scented with ash, vinegar, worn fabric, and despair's peculiar perfume, yet something felt different about this blizzard. The very air seemed to hold its breath, watching. More than once, she wondered if winter would finally finish what it started, not through starvation, though provisions dwindled, but through the slow dissolution of any reason to continue. Some nights she questioned the falling snow, asking why it hesitated, wondering what it awaited. She never expected an answer. Just as dusk claimed the last light, it came. 7 deliberate knocks, each more confident than the last. Not desperate or pleading, simply purposeful, like destiny introducing itself at her threshold. Sophie's hands froze in the flour sack, eyes fixed on the door as if it might speak. No visitors had come in years. The last was a lawman seeking a runaway, sent away with bread and false words. Her approach was cautious, mind spinning with possibilities, outlaws, drunkards, phantoms. Her trembling fingers found the iron latch, drew 2 steadying breaths, then pulled the barrier aside. 7 figures stood silhouetted against the white canvas of night. Warriors tall enough to dwarf her doorframe, wrapped in furs, feathers, leather, and snow's embrace. Comanche, she knew immediately from their bone ornaments, braided hair, eyes that met hers without flinching. The nearest stepped forward, snow melting on strong cheekbones, a pale scar marking his chin. His hood fell back. "Shelter," he requested simply. His voice carried the storm's own depth, speaking only for this moment. Sophie's heart awakened to a rhythm she'd forgotten. Beyond him, she saw no visible weapons, no hunger in weathered faces, only exhaustion. He waited patiently while wind clawed at their cloaks like starving animals. She stepped aside. Their presence transformed everything: heat, balance, the very quality of silence. Without instruction, they removed their boots at her threshold. One warmed his hands, another knelt prayerfully beside the stove. No words passed between them, yet they carried a different kind of quiet, not the crushing type she knew, but one that listened. Sophie lit another lamp, hands trembling as she ladled what remained of her root cellar stores into bowls. The scarred leader accepted his portion with gentle gratitude, murmuring thanks like a man who understood hunger's lessons. They consumed their meal slowly, with the reverence of those who'd known scarcity. She observed them closely, one rebraiding his hair with cold stiffened fingers, another carving bone while sitting cross-legged, a third cleaning his hands with snow and lard. These were not raiders, at least not tonight. They were travelers carrying countless miles and weary bones. Her gaze returned repeatedly to the scarred one. His face held something beyond mere softness, a clarity born of understanding. He didn't watch her with appetite, but with the recognition of one soul seeing another that knew silence intimately. Hours passed without speech until she finally offered, "The loft has space and blankets." He nodded simply. "Floors serve us fine." The others were already arranging their furs near glowing coals, moving with practiced unity. No commands necessary. Just instinct, men who'd shared winters, wars, and worse trials. Sophie climbed to the loft anyway, returning with her finest quilts, the ones Henry's mother had sewn before cold claimed her. She draped each sleeping form with maternal care, barely breathing. When she reached the scarred one, she paused. His eyes were closed, yet his hand emerged, fingers gently closing over hers. Not grasping, but promising, confirming his reality, his seeing of her. She withdrew, heart stuttering like it had just remembered its purpose. Sleep eluded her. Wind screamed with renewed fury, branches snapping like bones outside. Snow sealed her windows completely. But within these walls, fire burned bright. 7 strangers and 1 woman maintained its glow not through words but through shared presence. Morning found the scarred one remaining while others gathered more firewood than she'd seen in years. He spoke little, but when she brought him tea, her final herbs steeped in heated water, he offered a small carved stone in return. Smooth and round, shaped like a hunting hawk. She cradled it like precious crystal, their fingers touched again. She wanted to ask why he stayed, why he carved this gift, why he looked at her with such familiar recognition. But silence felt sacred, and he smiled in understanding. That evening, Sophie sat alone in her rocking chair, the carved hawk warm in her lap, staring into flames that might hold answers to questions her heart dared not voice. Outside, the storm began its retreat. Inside her, something else stirred to life, something ancient, aching, impossibly warm. Just before sleep claimed her, she heard the wind shift direction. Not away from her isolated sanctuary, but toward something. Toward someone. Dawn arrived early, painting frost-laced windows with pale silver light. The stove's final coals crackled their last breath while Sophie woke in her chair, still clothed from the night before, a quilt draped across her lap like forgotten dreams. For a moment, uncertainty clouded her mind. Had they truly come? These silent warriors who transformed sharp silence into something warm? Then she heard it, the steady rhythm of wood being split behind the barn. Not frantic or careless work, but measured, intentional, like a man settling debts with quiet dignity. She rose stiffly, wrapping her shawl against air that bit even indoors. Below, one figure stirred among sleeping furs, coughed softly, then settled back into dreams. Opening her door released breath-stealing wind and revealed snow stretched endlessly. Waist-deep in places, drifted high against fence lines. There, half hidden by the barn's lean-to, stood the scarred one. Shirtless despite bitter cold, steam rising from his body like heat from a blacksmith's forge. His long dark hair was pulled back with leather cord, arms swinging the axe with fluid precision. Behind him, a fresh mountain of split wood grew steadily. This wasn't display or pride, simply necessity being met. She didn't call out, content to watch until he spoke without turning mourning. His voice carried deeper notes now, quieter than the night before, vibrating between them like a cello's opening chord. She stepped closer, chin tucked against the cold. "You'll freeze to death?" "No," he replied, driving steel through wood. "Cold sharpens the edge, keeps a man honest." Words failed her, so she retreated inside, warming what little porridge remained, adding precious dried apples she'd hoarded for weeks. When the others woke, they moved without chaos, folding furs, shaking boots, waiting silently for bowls. Names remained unshared, and somehow this felt respectful, like each word carried weight requiring careful earning. The scarred one sat apart, but near her kitchen counter. When she handed him his portion, their fingers brushed without either pulling away. After breakfast, They worked without requests. 3 reinforced storm-damaged barn walls. 2 others carved a path from house to creek. 1 repaired the sagging henhouse gate with rawhide strips. The scarred one returned to his axe. Always the axe. Sophie couldn't fathom why these men, Comanche warriors feared by every settler within 100 miles, treated her humble home like sacred ground worth mending. More puzzling still, she felt safer than she had in years. By noon, wind calmed and sky broke into patches of dull silver. An older man with gray-streaked hair sat beside her porch, carving bone with slow, rhythmic motions. He didn't speak English, or perhaps chose silence. When their eyes met, he nodded, as if saying, "We see you and mean no harm." She imagined her neighbors' reactions. A woman like her, alone, housing warriors in her kitchen, warming their bodies with her stove. The whispers would come, accusations of madness or worse, judgment, pressed against memory's glass like damning handprints. They'd judged her after Henry's death too, claiming she didn't grieve properly, that didn't bury him quickly enough, suggesting God had turned away. Yet none had lifted a finger when her roof sagged or her baby burned with fever. Only prayers when she needed presence. That evening, the youngest warrior, barely 25, placed carved driftwood shaped like a buffalo's head beside her fire, rough but strong, clearly a gift. He nodded once, solemn, then returned to his place on the floor. Sophie's throat tightened. Later, as flames danced and shadows lengthened, the scarred one approached her table. In lamplight, she saw his eyes clearly for the first time, gray not with coldness, but with the wear of stones smoothed by years of flowing water. His face bore stories he'd never told. "You're not afraid," he observed. "I was," she answered honestly. "But not anymore. Why not?" She hesitated. "Because none of you have taken what wasn't offered." A pause. "We're not what they claim." She met his gaze steadily. "Neither am I." Silence swelled again, soft now, comfortable, 2 souls listening for the same distant song. "Your name?" she asked. "Toto." The word settled in her chest like a missing puzzle piece she hadn't realized was absent. She offered her own. "Sophie." "May?" Toto repeated it once, quietly as if tasting it. "Sophie." Something reverent lived in his pronunciation, almost like a prayer left unsaid too long. That night, as wind rose again and sky threatened more snow, the men arranged their furs in the same quiet order. But Toto remained near the door, back to it, keeping watch, not for danger, but for her. Sophie observed from the stairs. For the first time in years, darkness held no dread. It felt like a blanket now, not a trap. In her room, she sat at the bed's edge, hands in her lap, feeling the carved hawkstone warm in her apron pocket. She'd always believed loneliness was a kind of living death. But perhaps it was something else, a waiting, a hollow space reserved. For someone who wouldn't demand she fill the silence, only share it. She dimmed her lamp and studied the ceiling, breathing steadily. Tomorrow might bring melting snow or fresh storms. The men might depart or stay longer. But something had already transformed within her, something too quiet to name, too sacred to rush to. Then, just as sleep reached for her, another knock came. Not at the door this time, but at her window. A single, soft tap. Then silence. She rose slowly, heart lifting with her body. Drawing back the curtain revealed him there, Toto, not with urgency or hunger, but with a calm, wordless question in his eyes, and Sophie said nothing. She simply opened the window. The first thaw whispered its arrival. A single drop from the eaves, then another. Snow began sagging along the roof's edge like shoulders releasing long-held grief. Days had passed since 7 Comanche warriors sought shelter. Now only one remained. Toto hadn't explained his staying. He simply hadn't left. Sophie didn't question. This. Each morning brought discovered repairs. Hinges mended with leather, logs stacked by size, fence lines reset where storms had bent them. He worked without instruction, slept near the hearth, always rising before her. Sometimes she wondered if he slept at all. Their words remained few, but silence between them softened. They moved like former strangers who now shared something raw. Not romance, not yet something older, like recognition. One afternoon, while She stirred the stew pot. Toto entered from the cold, tracking Snow without apology. He carried a rabbit already skinned, laid it on her table without ceremony. Sophie turned, wiped her hands on her apron, met his eyes. "Thank you." He nodded, then added, "You were running low." She hadn't told him this. He'd noticed, later, as rabbit simmered and the room filled with thyme and meat's rich scent. She set 2 bowls on the table, one at her place, one across. A simple act that felt like lighting a lantern in a long-darkened room. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the shelf above the hearth where yellowed books gathered dust. He picked up Walden, worn at the spine, turned it in weathered. "Hands, you read?" he asked. "Used to." Her voice sounded smaller than intended. "Still do," he said. "You just forgot." She didn't argue. That night they ate in near silence. When she set down her spoon, he spoke again. "You braid your hair differently." "No." She blinked, touched her head without thinking. Her hair had been falling into her eyes, so she'd pulled it back in a loose twist. "I haven't had reason to care about that," she said, attempting laughter. "You have reason now." His words dropped. Gently, like snow against glass, she looked at him and for once didn't look away, though something inside her pulled back, not from fear, from shame. She wasn't ready for what he might mean or what she might want. The next morning, Sophie avoided him. She scrubbed the wash basin harder than necessary, gathered kindling with stiff movements, busied herself with anything that kept her eyes down. She caught glimpses of him outside, repairing the henhouse, wiping frost from window panes, tying rope between barn and porch to guide them during storms. He didn't ask why she maintained distance. That night she found a bundle of cured jerky on the table. No note, just his care laid down quietly like a bridge she hadn't dared cross. Still, she didn't cross it. 3 more days passed. On the 4th, Sophie slipped while hauling water from the creek. Her boot caught hidden ice, and her hip struck frozen ground with a sickening crunch. The bucket spilled, her breath vanished. She lay still, eyes wide, unable to cry out. The pale, distant sky stretched above her. Snow beside her smelled of bark and earth and something older, like time folding upon itself. Then he was there. Toto appeared in silence, knelt beside her as if wind itself had guided him. His hands, warm and steady, slipped beneath her shoulders. "You fell," he said softly. She tried to nod, couldn't. Without asking, he lifted her. His arms cradled her like. She weighed nothing. But it was the gentleness that undid her, the way his cheek brushed hers as he adjusted his hold, how he shielded her face from wind with his shoulder. Inside, he laid her by the fire, removed her boots, pulled a quilt over her legs, then he disappeared. She closed her eyes. Pain throbbed dull and pulsing, not just in her hip but in places much older. When he returned with warm water and willow bark, he touched her only where necessary, brief, careful, never lingering. His fingers were calloused but reverent. "You need rest," he murmured. "I'll handle everything else." And he did. She watched, half drowsy, as he moved through her home like he belonged, tending the stove, feeding chickens, even rinsing spilled laundry she'd left in the basin. No ceremony, no pride, just presence. That night, Sophie didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought of his hands, not their strength but their restraint. When dawn broke, she rose slowly and walked to the kitchen. Her hips still ached, but she moved. She chose to move. She found him near the barn feeding horses. He turned at her approach. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "You should be careful. Snow still hides dangers." She smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was true. He stepped closer, hesitated, then reached up slowly and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. "You're strong," he said. "No," she whispered. He tilted his head. "You think?" "Strength means loud." She didn't know how to answer. Later that day, she found her mirror tucked behind a drawer, long forgotten. When she held it up, she barely recognized the woman reflected there. Her cheeks were fuller, her eyes steadier. Her hair, still unruly, was braided clean and tight. She set the mirror down and laughed quietly, then cried without shame. That evening she wore her burgundy scarf, the one she'd hidden in the trunk. "After Henry died?" Toto said nothing when he saw it, but his gaze softened and something unspoken passed between them. They ate together again. Their fingers brushed. This time, neither pulled away. When he stood to stoke the fire, she found herself watching how he moved, how careful he was with her belongings, how nothing about him demanded space, yet everything about him earned it. "Why did you stay?" she asked suddenly. He paused. The fire popped behind him. "You didn't ask me to leave," he said. It was a simple answer, but it filled the room like a hymn that night. As she climbed the ladder to the loft, she stopped halfway, looked down. Toto looked up from his blanket. "Will you keep the fire going tonight?" He nodded, and she slept soundly for the first time in years. But come morning, fresh boot prints marked the snow. Not his. They led to the barn and back into the woods. 3 sets. Not 2, not 1, 3. Sophie had always believed her heart wasn't built for winter. Not this kind. The long, starving type that outlasts wood piles and presses on souls like cold stones. She'd grown accustomed to pretending the ache was merely weather, but now something deeper moved beneath her ribs. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but motion, and it frightened her. Toto had returned from the tree line with 3 rabbits and a frown carved into his face like bark. He hadn't spoken of the tracks in snow, but Sophie saw it in his eyes. Something had shifted. The quiet in him wasn't just habit anymore, it was caution. That evening he didn't sit at the table. He stood near the window, sharpening his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. The sound was rhythmic, almost soothing, like an old lullaby cut. From stone. Sophie stirred stew in the pot, her fingers trembling more than they had last week. She could feel something winding tight between them, not resentment or distance, something watchful. "They were watching the barn," he said without turning. "Didn't come close, but they were there." Sophie didn't ask who. In the West, it was enough to know someone was near, someone with nothing good in their intentions. "I thought no one came this far," she said. He paused. "Most don't, but these men, they were not lost." She set the spoon down gently, her appetite curling inward. After supper, he insisted on checking the perimeter. She tried to stop him, offering to light more lanterns, bring the chickens inside, but he shook his head. "Lanterns are signals," he murmured. "Let darkness be your shield." Sophie stood on the porch while he vanished into trees, snow crackling beneath his boots like dried bones. Cold sliced at her cheeks, but she didn't go inside. She watched the woods, the outlines, the absence, until finally he returned, face wine-burnt and expression unreadable. 2 miles out, 3 men, whiskey and arrogance, he said. "Locals." That word dropped between them like a stone in shallow water. Locals meant judgment. Locals meant whispers that turned into torches if you didn't watch your back. That night, Toto moved his sleeping furs near the door. He carved another hawk, this one rougher, almost angry in its shape. Sophie didn't ask why. She simply brought him warm cider, the last of it, and set it beside him without speaking. He didn't thank her. He only looked at her hand as it withdrew and said softly, "You shouldn't have to live like this." She paused in the fire's glow, unsure what to do with such tenderness. "It's how I've lived for years," she said. "Years don't mean truth," he replied. Sophie returned to her chair, wrapping her shawl around herself as if it might hold her together. Sleep came fitfully. Snow fell again, muffling the world. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote yelped and was answered by silence. The next morning, Sophie collapsed. She'd risen early to break ice from the trough, a task her body remembered even as muscles begged for mercy. Cold bit into her hip as she leaned over the edge. Her breath caught wrong, knees buckled. Ground met her before she could call out. When she opened her eyes, the sky was spinning. Toto was beside her almost instantly. He carried her inside without asking, without speaking. His hands were gentler than snow. He set her by the fire wrapped in furs, then boiled willow bark until air smelled bitter and medicinal. "You're not eating enough," he said. She didn't argue, couldn't. He crushed herbs, pressed cloth to her side, knelt beside her for hours. Once she opened her eyes to find him sleeping upright, arms folded, knife still at his side, not for protection, just readiness, When she finally sat up on her own, the cabin had changed. Everything was cleaner, more ordered. Floor swept, windows cleared, a braid of sweetgrass now hung near the door. "You did all this," she murmured. He looked up from the stool where he was sharpening arrows. "You are not a burden," he said without blinking. Her throat tightened. Later that day, Sophie stood before the mirror again. Her hair had come undone, falling in soft curls she'd forgotten she possessed. Her face, pale and bruised, still held color. Her hands no longer shook. She pulled on her oldest dress, not from shame, but memory. It still fit, and somehow felt like armor. She stepped outside to find Toto skinning a rabbit on the porch. Snow had lightened to a soft drizzle of flakes, each one delicate and slow, as if time had decided to walk beside them instead of ahead. "You saved me," she said. "I stayed," he answered. It was the same thing. She sat beside him and helped with the rabbit, fingers clumsy but determined. They worked in silence, the kind that feels like conversation. That night, she made stew with care, adding dried sage and a single sliver of apple for sweetness. Toto ate slowly, as if tasting her effort. After dinner, he unrolled a fur blanket and motioned toward the hearth. "I'll stay by the fire tonight," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You can stay where you always stay." His eyes held hers. Then he nodded. That night, she slept with his breathing in rhythm behind her, not touching, just present. It was the safest she had ever felt. At dawn, Sophie found a note carved into wood, simple, sharp. "They're coming back." Her breath caught. She stepped outside, cold slicing again. The tracks were fresh, men on horseback, 3 of them. They had circled the barn, come close, looked inside. She found Toto by the creek, standing still, hand on his blade's hilt. "They know I'm here now," he said. "What will they do?" "Test." He looked at her, not with fear, but resolve. Sophie touched his arm. "You don't have to stay." His jaw tensed. "I do." Back at the cabin, Sophie loaded the stove with extra logs. She set 3 candles in windows, not as welcome but warning. She took down Henry's old rifle, though it hadn't fired in years. It felt wrong in her hands now. When Toto returned, he brought a satchel of supplies and a look in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "We can run," she offered. "No, they'll find us." He looked at her gently. "This place is yours. It's the first good I've seen in a long time." She looked at him. "And you?" "I was never meant to survive either," he said. "But you gave me fire again." She stepped forward slowly until she could feel his breath. "I don't want to lose this." "You won't," he promised. Then he turned toward the barn, and Sophie, heart pounding, watched the trees because someone was already moving through them. Sophie watched from the porch, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, breath curling and small. Ghosts. The sky had gone pewter gray, the kind that warned of more than weather. Wind didn't moan like before. It whispered warnings. Toto stood near the barn, eyes scanning the tree line as if he could read the future in swaying pines. He hadn't spoken much since tracks reappeared, 3 riders, same as before. But this time they hadn't just circled. They'd dismounted. They'd looked. He hadn't told Sophie exactly what he saw out there, but something in his posture had changed. Less patience, more storm. She'd seen it once when a coyote crept too close to the henhouse. The silence before movement. That was Toto's way. Stillness that gathered like thunder. He came back from the barn with the same measured steps as always. A glance toward the woodpile. Quick check on horses. But today he wore his blade visibly. His eyes didn't soften when they landed on her. They stayed sharp, fixed on something far beyond her shoulders. "They'll come today," he said. "How do you know?" "Because they've waited long enough. Because men like that don't walk away from what they think they're owed." Sophie gripped the porch rail. Her fingers looked older in this light, worn, scarred, but steady. "They think I'm something to take," she said, not asking. He nodded once. "And they'll see I'm not something to let go." She exhaled slowly. There was no bravado in his voice, no pride, just certainty that he would stand between her and harm. Even if it meant breaking something inside himself to do it. By midday, the silence cracked. hooves crunching through snow, not rushed or panicked, confident. The kind of rhythm that said, "We've already decided what happens next." Toto was already outside. Sophie stayed near the door, rifle in hand, though it felt like a lie in her arms. She hadn't fired it in years. The rust smelled of ghosts. 3 men emerged from the trees. Locals. She recognized one. Cal Dorsey. Broad-shouldered and mean-eyed, the kind who never said a full sentence without cursing something weaker. He rode up slow, grinning like a man who thought he'd already won. "Well, well," Cal said, dismounting. "Ain't this a picture?" Little prairie widow with a red man guarding her doorstep. Toto said nothing. The second man, wiry with a busted lip, chuckled. "Heard you was playing house, Sophie. Word travels even." "In storms?" She stepped forward, rifle raised but not pointed. "You got no business here." "Oh, we got business," Cal said. "You just don't like the terms? This here's still white land. You taking in Comanche like a husband makes folks nervous." "He's not my husband," Sophie said quickly, then regretted it. Toto didn't move, didn't blink. Cal's smile widened. "So he's just living here? Sleeping in your bed, eating your food, chopping your wood like a tamed dog? That it?" The insult didn't land where it was meant. Toto didn't flinch, but something in his jaw shifted. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, a flicker, then the third man, young, flushed, hands twitching on the reins, stepped forward, shotgun loosely cradled in his arms. "We just want a word, just a little conversation." Toto finally spoke. "One step closer, and you'll have more than words." The silence that followed was deep enough to hear a bird shift its weight on a distant branch. Cal's smile turned. Not fear. Anger. He stepped forward. "You threatening us?" "I'm promising you. It happened fast." The third man raised his shotgun, twitchy and stupid. Sophie screamed, the sound catching in cold air like glass breaking. Toto moved not with rage, not with sound, like lightning carved into a man's shape. He crossed the snow and drove his shoulder into the shooter's chest before the gun could fire. They fell hard, snow exploding around them. The weapon clattered. Across the ground, a shout rose, Cal grabbing for his revolver. Sophie raised her rifle, arms shaking, but she fired. The bullet missed, striking the tree beside Cal's head. He flinched just enough. Toto was up again, dragging the third man by the collar, hurling him into a drift. His knife flashed now, drawn. In one clean motion, the second man lunged with a knife of his own, but Toto was already turning, already inside the arc of the swing. Steel met flesh, a scream. The second man fell to his knees, blood pouring from his thigh. Not fatal, but enough to end the fight. Cal stood alone now, gun in hand, face pale. He looked at Toto, at Sophie, at the mess of snow and blood and whatever. False courage he'd carried into this place dissolved into wind. "Go," Toto said. "You walk out, or you stay and get buried." Cal hesitated, then backed away. His boots made no sound now, just retreat. He left the others. They could crawl or not. He didn't care. When trees swallowed him, Toto finally looked back at Sophie. Her rifle was lowered, her breath ragged. "You were right," she whispered. "They came." He walked to her slowly, blood on his hand, not his own. She touched his wrist. He didn't stop her. "I'm not ashamed," she said, voice trembling, "of you, of this." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time something broke inside him, not hardness, restraint. The way a man breaks when he realizes the thing he's been protecting no longer needs protecting, just needs him. "I would have died for you." He said. "You live for me," she answered. He leaned his forehead to hers. Wind howled again, but it was different now. Not threat, release, later. After they tied the injured men to their horses and pointed them down the trail, Sophie found Toto cleaning his blade by the stream. The blood washed away easy. The storm inside him did not. "You've seen worse," she said. "Yes, but I never wanted to bring it here." "No." She stood beside him, hands folded. "Then let's not let it stay." He looked at her, eyes steady. "We'll rebuild." "The fence tomorrow." "We'll rebuild everything," she said. He nodded, and for the first time, he smiled truly, like the man he might have been before the storms came.